Section 17 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 14. The New York Symphony Orchestra, Part 2. For many years, I accepted long summer engagements with 2 concerts every day, first at Willow Grove near Philadelphia, and then at Ravinia Park on the North Shore near Chicago. The former became a great educational factor, as Philadelphia at that time had no orchestra of its own. Willow Grove Park is situated 17 miles from that city and was built by the Rapid Transit Company in order to stimulate travel on their trolley lines. The first season, for which a military band had been engaged, had not proven a success, and I was invited the following year in the hope that a symphonic organization might do better. I began by giving them popular programs of good music, with a regular symphony night every Monday and a Wagner program every Friday evening, with excellent results. Our audiences usually numbered from 15 to 20,000. The Rapid Transit Company, realizing the importance of the concerts, promptly built a huge open-air auditorium after my own design, consisting of only a roof on pillars, connecting with the shell in which the orchestra was placed. The acoustics proved exceedingly good, and the out-of-doors atmosphere was preserved. I continued these concerts for 7 seasons, thereby developing an audience for symphonic music, which eventually and inevitably demanded a resident orchestra of its own. Today, the Philadelphia Orchestra, under the leadership of Leopold Stokowski, ranks as one of the foremost of our country. Its concerts are crowded to the doors, and I like to think that our 7 years of pioneer work in Willow Grove have helped to lay its foundations. I also conducted a series of concerts at Ravinia Park, organized by the Chicago and Milwaukee Electric Railway to serve a similar commercial purpose. Chicago had, of course, enjoyed for years the splendid winter concerts of the Chicago Orchestra, first under Theodore Thomas and then under his successor, Frederick Stock. But this was the first time that symphonic concerts were given during the summer amid such charming surroundings on the borders of Lake Michigan. These concerts proved exceedingly popular, the audiences consisting not only of the North Shore residents, but of thousands who came out from Chicago on trains and trolleys. After several years of this work, however, the incessant daily concerts coming after an arduous winter season began to pall on my musical nerves. I ran a real danger, if I continued, of becoming nothing but a musical routinier, with an inevitable loss of the enthusiasm and freshness which is an absolute necessity for the interpreter. I therefore gave up all conducting during the summer months. I founded the Damrosch Opera Company in 1895, and the harassing question of how to maintain my orchestra seemed solved, for during the first year my opera season lasted 13 weeks, and during the following 3 years, from 20 to 30 weeks each. This not only enabled me to maintain a beautifully trained orchestra for the Wagner operas, but also gave to my symphony performances a greater finish. The orchestra was now under my exclusive control, and could rehearse as often as the endowed orchestra of Major Higginson. But as it was the opera that enabled me to give my men such a long engagement, its needs had to control all other arrangements, and gradually the regular sequence of my winter concerts in New York began to suffer. I could not keep my opera company in New York, except for a limited period each year, and therefore had to fill in much of my time in Philadelphia, Boston, and the larger cities of the South and Middle West. In 1899, I was therefore finally compelled to give up the regular subscription series of our New York concerts, and the New York Symphony Orchestra became a part of my traveling operatic organization. I made this sacrifice with a heavy heart, but at that time it was the only solution. An orchestra devoted only to concerts could not be maintained without an endowment, and that I did not have at the time, while the length of my Wagner opera season enabled me not only to give my men a good engagement, but to have the pick of the best musicians in New York. From then on until 1903, most of our playing of symphonic music was only on our spring concert tours and at irregular intervals in New York. In 1900, Maurice Grau asked me to conduct the Wagner operas at the Metropolitan, and in the spring of 1902, at the close of my second season with him, I received an invitation from the New York Philharmonic Society to become its conductor. This invitation was a great surprise to me, as the Philharmonic had been, ever since my father's day, the rival orchestra. In many ways it seemed a flattering proposition, as it was the oldest organization of its kind in America and had had an honorable history. Under the leadership of Theodore Thomas and later on of Anton Seidel, the audiences had been large and its affairs had prospered. It had always been a cooperative association composed of the members of the orchestra who had complete control of its affairs, receiving no salaries, but dividing the profits equally among themselves at the end of each season. I accepted the conductorship, but found very soon that my acceptance was a blunder. The society had come upon evil days, and under its last conductor attendance had dwindled to less than one-half. Of the membership of the orchestra, only the skeleton remained, and I found to my amazement that of the 100 players at the concerts, less than 50 were actual members of the organization, the rest being engaged from outside, and often changed from one concert to another. Some of the members were old men who should no longer have played in the orchestra at all, but they were devoted to the concerts of the society, and as the orchestra was regulated by their votes, they naturally would not vote themselves out of it. Many of them had been excellent musicians and were personally upright men, but age, alas, is no respecter of technique, and the fingers of the left hand and the muscles of the bow arm gradually stiffen with advancing years. Most of the wind instruments were outsiders, and therefore could not be properly controlled regarding their attendance at rehearsals and concerts, while, on the contrary, nearly all the first violins were old members, several of whom were no longer fit to play first violin. The fact was that Major Higginson of Boston, with his permanent orchestra composed of young men, many of them the best of their kind, with their daily rehearsals and at least 75 symphony concerts a season, had set a new standard of orchestral technique, which the old Philharmonic, under its archaic conditions, could not hope to equal. The only solution seemed to me to lie in gathering together a fund large enough to produce the same conditions and results as Higginson had achieved in the Boston Orchestra, and above all, to put the management of the Philharmonic into the hands of a committee, which should not be composed of members of the orchestra, but of music lovers and guarantors of the fund. I discussed this idea with several of my friends and some old subscribers and friends of the Philharmonic at a meeting held on January 5, 1903, and it was resolved to obtain a fund of $50,000 a year for 4 years, to be administered for the benefit of the Philharmonic Society as a permanent orchestra fund by a board of 15 or more trustees, but it was not to be subject to the control of the Philharmonic Society. This fund was to be the beginning of an endowment for a permanent orchestra, of which the Philharmonic Society was to be the nucleus. The terms of the deed of trust under which the fund was to be held were to be determined by a committee of 3, consisting of Mr. Samuel Untermeyer, Mr. John Notman, and Mr. E. Francis Hyde. The members of the Philharmonic Orchestra were not unfavorably disposed toward our scheme. The idea of being guaranteed a yearly salary instead of sharing problematic yearly profits naturally appealed to them. But when our committee explained to them that, under the terms of such an endowment, several of the plain members would have to resign their places because in the opinion of the committee they had passed the age of usefulness, they rebelled. Nor did they feel inclined to give up the absolute management of their concerts. Among the most respected members of the Philharmonic Orchestra were 2 old violinists. The one, Richard Arnold, vice president of the society, had been concertmaster under my father 25 years before, and still officiated in that position in the Philharmonic. The other, August Rubelin, who had played as first violinist in the orchestra for nearly 40 years, had also acted as manager of the society and unselfishly given his best energies to its affairs. As a violinist, however, He had passed his time of usefulness. Our committee, perhaps rather bluntly, informed the Philharmonic Committee that under the reorganization, the selection of the orchestra must be left in the hands of the conductor, and that Mr. Arnold would have to content himself with a second position at the first stand, so that a younger artist could become concertmaster, and that several of the first violinists, among them Mr. Oberlin, would have to be retired altogether. I had made it particularly clear that my selection as conductor for the following year was not in any way a necessary part of the reorganization scheme, as it seemed to me that the only way to achieve a real permanent orchestra for New York was to unite the conflicting factions and to let the choice of conductor be made after the organization had been properly placed upon a sound and comprehensive basis. After lengthy negotiations, the Philharmonic, in a letter of February 28, 1903, definitely refused the offer of the Reorganization Committee because, as their secretary expressed it, the amendments required by our committee would so change the nature of the society as to seriously interfere with the control of its affairs by its members, which has always been its vital principle, and that the future prosperity of the society would therefore be impaired. As I had no desire to continue another year with the orchestra on the basis of existing conditions, I wrote to Mr. Arnold and requested that my name be not proposed as a candidate for the following year. I had been in a very delicate position during all this time, as I had grown quite fond personally of some of the very men whom, for artistic reasons, it was necessary to retire. It was not in human nature that they should have seen themselves as others saw them, or heard themselves as others heard them, and at our rehearsals and concerts they all certainly gave the best that was in them. The changes which I had proposed were necessary, however, if the society expected to continue its existence as an orchestral body. For a few years they staved off the inevitable by engaging for each season a number of European guest conductors. This served as a stopgap, as it diverted the attention of the audience from the deficiencies in the orchestra to the different and interesting personalities and musical specialties of the conductors. But then a reorganization plan, exactly on the lines originally proposed by me, completely eliminating the power of the orchestral players to manage the concerts or to select the players in the orchestra, was accepted by them, and today the orchestra of the Philharmonic Society is organized and successfully working on exactly the same basis as the New York Symphony Society and the Boston Orchestra. For me, the rejection of our reorganization plan was at the time naturally a great disappointment, but not for long, as my efforts had made new friends for me and in a new direction, which eventually proved a turning point in my life. On March 19, 1903, I received a letter which read as follows: I have been instructed by the members of the Permanent Orchestra Fund Committee to express to you their appreciation of the spirit of unselfishness and of loyalty to the highest artistic interests which has characterized your attitude during the negotiations which have been in progress between our committee and the Philharmonic Society. We regret that a consolidation of our interests has proved impossible, but we relinquish the plan we had in view with the greatest respect and admiration for your broad attitude of mind in regard to the undertaking, for your musicianship, and for your devotion to the cause of music in which we are all working. Harry Harkness Flagler, Secretary, Permanent Orchestra Fund. Years before I had met Mr. Flagler through his friend Max Alvary, when the latter was a member of the Damrosch Opera Company, but the meeting was quite casual, and I had not seen him again until the meetings of the Philharmonic Orchestra Fund Committee, of which he had become a member. I had been singularly attracted by him and his gentle and quiet, almost diffident manner. He had been a great lover of music all his life, and had found in his wife Anne an enthusiastic companion in his love for the art. As the reorganization scheme of the Philharmonic Orchestra gradually unfolded itself, he became more and more interested in it as the right solution of the problem of developing a symphony orchestra in New York, which should be the equal of the Boston Symphony or the Chicago Orchestra, and he was ready to help such a scheme to the fullness of his financial ability. Very quickly after the failure of this project, many of the forces concerned recruited themselves anew, and a large proportion of the would-be guarantors turned to me with the suggestion to reorganize the New York Symphony Orchestra, and by subsidizing all the first players, and thereby binding them to the orchestra, make a new beginning in the right direction. During the interregnum of 3 years, the orchestra had maintained itself fairly well through the earnings of our long spring tours and summer engagements, but I joyfully hailed this opportunity to renew the New York winter concerts. A reorganization of the Symphony Society of New York was quickly effected by the re-election of most of the old directors and of many new ones. My old and loyal friend Daniel Frohman, at whose theater I had given many a Wagner lecture in the years past, accepted the presidency pro tem and was of great assistance in procuring outside work for the members of the orchestra. He was succeeded by Mr. Samuel Sanford, a man of real musical ability, who had founded the musical department at Yale University and had contributed liberally to many musical enterprises. He immediately became one of the largest guarantors of our orchestra fund. We accordingly resumed our New York concerts under the best possible auspices, with an enthusiastic directorate and a large subscription list. I was, however, not satisfied with the woodwind players at that time available in New York. The musical union, which controlled all orchestral players, had made the influx of good musicians from Europe almost an impossibility by insisting that a player must have lived at least 6 months in this country before he could join the union, and that until he became a member, no other member of the union would be allowed to play with him, as all orchestral engagements in opera, concert, or theater were in the hands of union men. This meant that the newcomer would have to starve for 6 months before he could begin to earn $1 toward his maintenance. This law was not enforced by the union men for patriotic reasons, as most of them had been born in Europe, but because they feared the possible competition for the positions they monopolized. The best woodwind players at that time, and generally speaking this applies today, were French or Belgian. The Conservatoire of Paris has for years produced very superior artists on these instruments. The Boston Orchestra, which is non-union, had several among its members, and their exquisite tone and beautiful phrasing always particularly enraged me because, owing to the union restrictions, I could not have players of equal merit. I determined, therefore, to throw down the gauntlet to the union by deliberately going to France to engage the 5 best artists I could find in flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and trumpet, demonstrate their superior excellence to anything we could obtain in New York at that time, and, through the pressure of public opinion, and, above all, the necessity of artistic competition with the Boston Symphony, force the union to accept these men as members. When the Frenchmen arrived, the rage among the members of the New York Union knew no bounds. I had a summer engagement for the orchestra on one of the roof gardens, but the union refused to let them play with us except as soloists, and I determined to take the matter higher up to the annual convention of the National Federation of Musicians, which was held in Detroit in the summer of 1905. I found the national delegates much more amenable to reason than my New York colleagues. There were more real Americans among them, and many of them listened to my pleadings with interest and sympathy. The president of the Federation, Joseph N. Weber, is a man of real intellectual ability, and while he and I have had some violent quarrels and disagreements during these many years, and while I have sometimes denounced him to his face as a fanatic, and he has given me tit for tat, I must acknowledge that he not only has had the ability to build up a remarkable organization of great power, but has often acted with great fairness in disputes that have come up between the directors of the New York Musical Union and myself. The National Federation decided in my favor and gave me the permission to incorporate these 5 Frenchmen in my orchestra and to enroll them as members of the New York Union, but as I had sinned against the laws of the Federation in bringing them over from a foreign country, I was fined $1,000. It was, however, intimated to me privately that if I would return to the next convention of the Federation, which was to be held in Boston the following summer, I would in all probability receive a remission of the greater part of this fine. It is needless for me to say that I never saw any part of that $1,000 again. I returned to New York jubilant and my French players proved themselves such superior artists that, together with our other excellent members, many of whom had been with me for years, the orchestra quickly took rank among the best in the country. The leader of my first violins was Mr. David Maness. I had discovered him a few years before at one of the New York theaters, where he was a member of the little orchestra, and where I heard him play a solo charmingly between the first and second acts. The beautiful quality of his tone and a fine sensitiveness to the malice of the work he was playing attracted me, and I engaged him for the last stand of the first violins. From there he was quickly promoted until he occupied the position at the first stand of concertmaster. He married my sister Clara, a pianist of fine accomplishment. Their sonata recitals have become models of intimate unity in chamber music playing, and several years ago they founded the David Maness Music School. This encroached so much upon his time and energy as to compel him to resign his position in the New York Symphony Orchestra, which he had held so honorably for many years. Each year, the guarantee fund for the maintenance of the orchestra was increased by the supporters of the New York Symphony Society, and more men were engaged on regular weekly salaries. At last my dream was realized, and New York had an orchestra organized on the same lines as the Boston and Chicago orchestras, devoted exclusively to symphonic music and assembling daily for rehearsal. The fund at this time reached over $50,000 a year, mainly subscribed by the directors of our organization. Several of these had been supporters from my father's time, among them Isaac N. Seligman, who, with his family, had been interested in music in New York for many years. Others had come into the organization when I became its conductor, and had remained loyal supporters and close friends from that time on. Among them were Richard Welling, a director since 1886, a well-known lawyer and reformer in municipal politics, and who, as a member of the Naval Reserves, promptly enlisted as an ensign when we entered the Great War, although he was then well over 50 years of age. Miss Mary R. Callender and Miss Carolyn DeForest, who had been directors since 1885. Miss Callender further signalized her affection for the orchestra by leaving $50,000 to the pension and sick fund after her death in 1919. The complete list of the subscribers to the fund at the time was as follows: Mrs. H.A. Alexander, Mr. C.B. Alexander, Miss Cora F. Barnes, Mrs. William H. Bliss, Miss Mary R. Callender, Mr. Robert J. Collier, Mrs. Paul D. Cravath, Mr. Paul D. Cravath, Miss Carolyn DeForest, Mr. Charles H. Ditson, Mrs. S. Edgar, Miss A. C. Flagler, Mr. Harry Harkness Flagler, Mr. Edward S. Flagler, Mrs. Frances Hellman, Mr. Otto H. Kahn, Mr. A. W. Kretsch, Mrs. Daniel Lamont, Mr. Albert Lewison, Mr. Frank A. Munsey, Mr. Emerson McMillan, Madam Nordica, Mr. Stephen S. Palmer, Mrs. Trenner L. Park, Mr. Amos Pinchot, Mrs. Joseph Pulitzer, Mr. Thomas F. Ryan, Mr. Charles E. Sampson, Mr. Samuel S. Sanford, Mr. R. E. Shermer, Mr. Henry Seligman, Mrs. Henry Seligman, Mr. Isaac N. Seligman, Mr. Jefferson Seligman, Mrs. Jessie Seligman, Mr. Frank H. Simmons, Miss Clara B. Spence, Mrs. F. T. Van Buren, Mr. Richard Welling, Mrs. J. A. Zimmerman, Mr. Paul Warburg. The ideal conditions under which I now worked gave me the opportunity to carry out several artistic plans which I had had for a long time. The first of these was a Beethoven cycle, in which I gave not only all the 9 symphonies in chronological order, but other compositions of Beethoven, some of which had not yet appeared on the concert programs of New York. Accordingly, in the winter of 1909, I prepared 6 programs composed of Beethoven's works, and at the last concert gave a double performance of his 9th Symphony. This was a real tour de force, but not original with me. During the summer of 1887, which I had spent with von Bülow in study of the Beethoven symphonies, he had told me of having given such a double performance in Berlin, and that the results had been very remarkable, inasmuch as at the second hearing the audience had been able the more perfectly to grasp many of the intricacies of this Hamlet among symphonic dramas. Our double performance caused a great deal of comment most of which was very favorable. Between the two performances, the orchestra and chorus were refreshed with hot coffee and sandwiches, and as the work takes about an hour and 10 minutes to perform, the repetition, together with a half-hour of rest between, brought the final tumultuous outburst of the choral Ode de Joy to 11 o'clock. Notwithstanding the lateness of the hour, the audience began a great demonstration of approval, applauding and shouting for many minutes. But while I and my performers took some of this as ours by right, I have always felt that the audience intended a good part of it as directed toward themselves, or having so nobly endured the great strain which I had put upon them. This was the first Beethoven festival ever given in New York, and a few years later I organized a Brahms festival on similar lines. I directed his 4 symphonies, the ingratiating cembalist playing the violin concerto, Wilhelm Bachhaus, the great B-flat piano concerto, and my brother with the chorus of the Oratorio Society conducting a very beautiful performance of the Requiem. Such festivals devoted exclusively to the work of one composer are a great lesson to the serious music lover, and I think that as Beethoven represents almost the alpha and certainly the omega of symphonic music, there should be repetitions of Beethoven cycles every few years. I have never been able to understand why it should not be similarly possible to give Shakespearean cycles in spring, in which all of our best actors could combine to make up ideal casts. We should certainly make American children as familiar with Shakespeare's great tragedies as, for instance, the children of Germany, to whom Shakespeare is much more of a household word than he is to those of this country or England. If music can find Flaglers and Higginsons to endow it as an educational necessity, why cannot similar men be found to do the same for the drama, and thus help to lift it as an educational factor from its painfully weak position to which the necessities of making it a paying institution have driven it? During all these years, my relations with Mr. and Mrs. Flagler became more and more intimate. I had never met such people in my entire life. Their devotion to and interest in the orchestra increased constantly, and Mr. Flagler's contributions to the fund became greater and greater as the needs of the orchestra increased. But his help was offered with a shyness, as if it had been the orchestra that conferred the benefit upon him. He also took over a work which I had always detested more than anything else, and that is the collection of funds. As the expenses of the orchestra increased with the years, it became necessary to collect money from outside sources beyond the large sums already contributed by the directors of the society. With constant good humor, patience, and infinite tact, Mr. Flagler, whose own donations to the fund were greater in proportion to his income than those of many others, would write letters or call personally on well-to-do musical patrons to collect perhaps a few $100 toward the fund, and he would be inordinately proud of his success as a financier and collector. Finally, even his infinite patience wore out under this yearly strain, and this manifested itself in a very remarkable way. In the spring of 1914, he quietly informed me that he had decided to assume the entire financial responsibility of the orchestra himself, and to contribute all necessary funds for its proper maintenance. This amount was double what would have been considered necessary 10 years before, but salaries of orchestral players and other expenses in connection with the giving of concerts had increased enormously, and it was Mr. Flagler's desire that, while there should be no waste, the affairs of the orchestra should be managed in such liberal fashion that the artistic needs could first be considered in shaping its policy. This magnificent and unique act naturally created a great excitement in the musical circles of New York, and Mr. Flagler was universally acclaimed as its foremost musical citizen. I have a characteristic letter of his, dated August 31st, 1914, in which he says, "Indeed, I am not over-modest about my gift to the Symphony Society. It is not that, but what I am doing is so little in comparison with what the real makers of music, creators, and interpreters like yourself do for the betterment of the world through their art, that it doesn't deserve to be thought of. I am proud and happy in the thought that I may be the means of helping you to put before the world your ideas in regard to the interpretations of the masters, and to bring the God-given art of music to many who would not otherwise have its uplifting and consoling power, and that is what we are doing together. You shall be free as never before to work out your own ideas, unfettered by thoughts of the financial necessities. Since then, the Society has pursued the even tenor of its way and, freed from all financial worries, has contributed much to the cause of music. The orchestra plays over 100 symphony concerts during the winter in New York and elsewhere. These include a series of Sunday afternoon concerts at Aeolian Hall, Thursday afternoon and Friday evening concerts at Carnegie Hall, and a series of young people's concerts and another of children's concerts. There are also subscription concerts in Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and Rochester, and several tours every winter to Canada and the Middle West. During the war, Mr. Flagler often gave the services of the orchestra for charities connected with the war, and several times donated the gross receipts of our regular concerts to such organizations as the American Friends of Musicians in France, in which he and his wife became very much interested. But perhaps the climax in the history of the orchestra was reached in its great European tour in the spring of 1920. To this I shall devote a separate chapter following one on my experiences in France during the Great War. End of section 17.